On the evening of the 19th of January, 1931, a telephone rang in a cafe in Liverpool. Upstairs, a chess club was playing. The call was for a man who had not arrived yet. The caller gave a name, Qualtrough, and a message. He wanted to discuss an insurance matter. The following evening, 7:30, 25 Menlove Gardens East. The message was written down and passed on. There was no 25 Menlove Gardens East. There was a Menlove Gardens North, a South, and a West. There was no East. Investigators never identified the caller or found a real R.M. Qualtrough connected with the appointment. The next evening, the man who had been sent to that address spent the better part of an hour looking for it. He asked tram conductors. He asked a policeman. He asked a woman at her own front door. When Wallace returned, Julia was found dead in the front parlour. The medical evidence did not establish with certainty whether she died before or after he left. No one has ever been convicted of her murder. Her name was Julia Wallace. Her husband, William Herbert Wallace, was tried for her murder and sentenced to death, and then the Court of Criminal Appeal quashed the conviction. What follows is not a solution. It is an account of what the record contains, and of how little of it can be pinned down. This is Madame Noir, the cases they don't tell you in English. Today we are examining the case of the murder of Julia Wallace. 29 Wolverton Street was a small terraced house in Anfield, Liverpool. The front parlour was normally reserved for visitors. William Herbert Wallace was 52. He was a prudential agent who collected premiums door to door, kept company money in a small cash box at home, and accounted to the district office each week. He also played chess. Julia played the piano. Trial witnesses described the couple as affectionate and on friendly terms. In 2001, the researcher James Murphy identified registry records indicating that Julia had been born in 1861, which would make her 69 when she died, and roughly 17 years older than her husband. We have not yet examined the birth certificate ourselves. If that identification is right, the age attributed to Julia in records and later accounts had been wrong for decades. Whether Julia herself supplied that age, and whether her husband knew, is not established. And since almost every account of this case is about her husband, let me stay with Julia a moment longer, because there is more on the record than the woman at the door with the milk can. Genealogical research describes her as born near North Allerton, in North Yorkshire, the daughter of William George Dennis and Anne Teresa Dennis. The same research states that her father was a farmer who gave up farming and died in 1875, leaving Julia orphaned in her early teens. We have not examined those records ourselves. She married William Herbert Wallace on the 24th of March 1914 at St. Mary's Church in Harrogate. The same accounts state that a more elevated version of her background circulated in later years than the records support, that her father had been a veterinary surgeon and her mother French. We have not verified this against primary documents, and I want to be careful about what it does and does not show. It does not establish that Julia said any of it. Who supplied which version and when is not on the record. The same limit that applies to her age applies here. What it does show is a gap. Between the woman in the registers and the woman in the accounts, there is a distance nobody has closed. And that is worth saying out loud, because 90 years of writing about this case has produced a detailed portrait of the man whose conviction was quashed, and a sketch of the woman who was killed. What is documented is small and ordinary. She kept a house on Wolverton Street. She played the piano. She had an interest in music and in French. Trial witnesses described the couple as affectionate and on friendly terms. On the evening of the 20th of January, 1931, she came to her own front door, took in the milk, and went back inside. Monday, the 19th of January, the Liverpool Central Chess Club met at a cafe in the city centre. At about 7:15, the telephone rang. It was answered first by a cafe employee named Gladys Harley, who then fetched Samuel Beatty, the captain of the chess club. Not a military captain, the captain of the club. The telephone exchange logged the connection at 20 past 7. The caller said his name was Qualtrough. He asked that a message be passed to Mr. Wallace, an insurance matter, the following evening at 7:30, 25 Menlove Gardens East. Wallace himself arrived at about 7:45. He was not there when the call came. Beatty gave him the message. Investigators traced the call to a public telephone at the junction of Rochester Road and Breckfield Road. The line was Anfield 1627. A telephone engineer named Leslie Heaton gave evidence about it. The call came from a box roughly 400 yards from the house. At trial, the prosecution treated that proximity as support for its allegation that Wallace had made the call, but the caller's identity and motive were never proved. The surviving record does not establish who made the call or why. Tuesday, the 20th of January. That evening, a 14-year-old milk boy named Alan Close delivered to 29 Wolverton Street. He testified that Julia Wallace came to the door herself and took the milk from him. That is the last time anyone reported seeing her alive. In court, Close said he had looked at the church clock at 6:25 and reconstructed his arrival at about 6:30. Elsie Wright, Douglas Metcalf, and Kenneth Caird testified that the following evening they heard Close give a time of about 6:45. Mr. Justice Wright described Close as apparently honest, but called his 6:30 timing reconstructed rather than fixed. The prosecution's available time window depended heavily on that uncertainty. Wallace himself said he left the house at about 6:45, roughly 6:45. Mr. Justice Wright told the jury that the tram timing and police test runs placed his departure somewhere between approximately 6:45 and 6:50. If Close's reconstructed 6:30 time was right, about 15 to 20 minutes remained. If the later 6:45 account was right, the gap was almost zero. The evidence did not resolve which timing was accurate. What happened next is unusually well documented because Wallace spoke to multiple witnesses. A tram conductor named Thomas Charles Phillips said his tram left at about 6 minutes past 7, or 10 past. The duty schedule pointed to 6 minutes past. Wallace was on it. A second tramman, Arthur Thompson, carried him onwards toward Menlove Gardens. On both journeys, Wallace asked about the address, repeatedly. He wanted to know where Menlove Gardens East was and where he should get off. I want to be careful here, because this detail usually comes with a word attached that is not in the evidence. The witnesses described a passenger asking questions. They did not describe a nervous man. Menlove Gardens was several miles from Enfield. Wallace traveled from the stop near St. Margaret's Church to Lodge Lane, changed towards Penny Lane, changed again, and continued towards Calderstones, getting off by Menlove Gardens West. The prosecution argued that the false address and the repeated inquiries created witnesses for an alibi. The defense argued that the same false address could also have kept Wallace away and given an intruder time to leave. Both readings were applied to the same journey. He began searching on foot. PC James Edward Sargent testified that their encounter occurred at about 7:45 and that both men checked their watches. He knocked at 25 Menlove Gardens West and spoke to the woman who lived there, Katie Mather, and a newsagent named Lily Pinchas placed his visit to her shop after 8 o'clock, possibly around 10 past, so the search ran on, past 8, in the dark, in January, through streets where the address he was looking for did not exist. He gave up and went home. At about 8:45, Wallace was back at Wolverton Street. His neighbors, John Sharp Johnston and Florence Sarah Johnston, were outside. He told them he could not get in. This part has to be told precisely, because almost every retelling compresses it. At the first attempt at the front door, Wallace said the key would not turn at all. At the second attempt it turned, but ran back without unlocking anything. At the back door, the knob or the latch behind it would not move. John Johnston did not have a spare key to the Wallace house. What he offered was his own back door key to try in Wallace's lock, and then before he fetched it, Wallace tried the back door again. It opened, apparently without a key at all, by turning the knob. Johnston said it went easily. Wallace went inside alone. The Johnstons waited in the yard. About a minute and a half later he came back out and asked them to come in. Julia Wallace was lying in the front parlour. She had been beaten about the head and she was dead. The surviving evidence does not establish why the doors behaved as described, whether anyone had manipulated them, or what significance the difficulty had. The house had been disturbed but not ransacked. In the kitchen, the door of a cabinet appeared to have been forced. Wallace took a cash box out of it, the box he used for his insurance collections, and said money was missing. Wallace reported that approximately £4 in Prudential collection money was missing. He accounted for it, about £14 taken on his round, about £10 10 shillings paid out, the rest kept. That arithmetic was not seriously challenged at trial, but the missing sum rests substantially on his own account of what had been in the box. The Wallace's charwoman, Jane Draper, testified that an iron bar and a poker she had previously seen were missing. She had last been in the house on the 7th of January. Neither object was recovered during the investigation or identified as the weapon. Detective Inspector Herbert Gold testified that he examined Wallace's clothing, his hands and his boots, and found no blood on him anywhere. His words in the trial record were that there was no sign of any blood upon him anywhere. That does not mean no forensic trace of any kind was recovered in the house. It means that on the man himself, clothes, hands, boots, there was none. If the time of death could be established, this case would be far simpler. The medical evidence did not say one thing. It said several, and they overlapped so widely that Mr. Justice Wright told the jury the medical evidence might not allow the time to be fixed at all. Professor John Edward Wheatley McFall appeared for the prosecution. He arrived at the house at about 10 to 10 that night. He took no body temperature, none at all. He estimated from rigor mortis and from the state of the blood. His contemporaneous report put the death at roughly 2 hours before his arrival. That is about 10 to 8 in the evening. At the trial he said something different. He told the court that his first observation had indicated more than 4 hours before 10 o'clock, which puts the death before 6 in the evening. He conceded a margin of error of up to an hour. McFall's contemporaneous report would place the estimated death while Wallace was away from Wolverton Street. His trial estimate would place it before Close said he saw Julia alive. Dr. Hugh Pierce first examined the body at about 10 to 12 that night and repeated his observations at intervals of approximately 15 to 20 minutes. He put the death at about 6 o'clock or later and then allowed a margin of 2 hours in either direction, 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Professor James Edward Dibble appeared for the defense. He had not examined the body at all. According to the judge's summing up, his position was that death had occurred either under 3 hours or over 4 hours before McFall's examination, not a single window, an either-or. He confirmed the death could have occurred after 7 in the evening, or considerably earlier, and that it could not be determined with certainty. 3 medical men, one with no thermometer, whose contemporaneous report and trial estimate differed, one with a 4-hour margin, one who never saw the body. A reliable time of death could have tested the prosecution's timeline sharply. It could not by itself have identified Julia's killer. The first report was made at Enfield Road, Bridwell. Detective Superintendent Hubert Moore of Liverpool CID arrived at Wolverton Street at about 10 that evening and took charge. In his report of the 28th of January, Moore described Wallace as strongly suspected, while also recording that nothing then found definitely brought the crime home to him. What is documented is the shape of the work. Officers reconstructed the tram journey with timed test runs. They took statements from the conductors, from the constable, from the householder and the newsagent. They traced the telephone box and the exchange log.
They searched for the missing objects and did not find them. Trial evidence established that Wallace collected premiums through the week and paid company money into the district office. The prosecution treated the reported loss as part of a staged robbery. The defense argued that robbery remained a reasonable possibility. Neither proposition was proved. On the 2nd of February, Inspector Gold, accompanied by Superintendent Moore and Superintendent Thomas, arrested Wallace at the Ullett Road address where he was staying. Gold recorded his reply. "What can I say in answer to this charge, of which I am absolutely innocent? 13 days had passed since Julia died."
The prosecution alleged that Wallace invented Qualtrough, made the call from a box near his own house, killed Julia the following evening, and gave himself an alibi by searching for an address that did not exist. No weapon had been recovered or identified. No blood was found on Wallace, there was no confession, and there was no eyewitness to the killing. The prosecution argued that Wallace could have worn only the mackintosh during the attack, thereby avoiding blood on his clothes. A partly burned mackintosh was found beneath Julia's body. This was the prosecution's theory, not a proved reconstruction. The theory remained unproved. The jury nevertheless had to decide whether the circumstantial evidence established it beyond reasonable doubt.
The trial ran at the Liverpool Assizes from the 22nd to the 25th of April, 1931, before Mr. Justice Wright, Edward Hemerdy, King's Counsel, led for the Crown, assisted by Leslie Walsh. Roland Oliver, King's Counsel, led for the defense, assisted by Sidney Schofield Allen. 4 days. The Crown's case was entirely circumstantial. No weapon had been recovered or identified. No blood was found on Wallace. There was no confession, and there was no eyewitness to the killing. Circumstantial evidence asks a jury to infer guilt from proved facts rather than from direct evidence of the act itself. The question was whether the evidence, taken as a whole, excluded reasonable possibilities consistent with innocence and proved Wallace's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense did not have to prove that somebody else killed Julia. The burden remained on the Crown throughout. The appeal judgment later described Wright's summing up as completely fair and accurate, and said that an acquittal would not have been surprising. After 4 days of evidence and argument, and a summing up the appeal court later called fair and accurate, the jury needed only a little over an hour to convict. The sentence was death, and then on the 18th and 19th of May, the Court of Criminal Appeal quashed the conviction. The Court of Criminal Appeal did not simply retry a case or substitute its view because a jury might properly have acquitted. Its approach to factual review was restrictive. Section 4, subsection 1 nevertheless required the court to allow an appeal if the jury's verdict could not be supported, having regard to the evidence. The court had used that ground before. During Wallace's appeal, Lord Hewitt noted that it had done so the previous week. In Wallace's case, it used the power to quash a capital conviction after examining the evidential record, not on a technicality, not on a procedural error. The court held that the verdict, in the words of the statute, could not be supported, having regard to the evidence. Lord Hewitt made the point that the court does not decide these things on suspicion, or on theories however ingenious. The published headnote reads that the court will quash a conviction founded on mere suspicion. The decision is reported as R. V. Wallace, 23 Criminal Appeal Reports, page 32. It was made under Section 4, subsection 1 of the Criminal Appeal Act of 1907. The modern phrase for it, an unsafe verdict, is terminology that came afterwards. I want to be precise about what that decision was, and what it was not. It was a decision about the weight of evidence. It was not a finding about who killed Julia Wallace. The court did not say Wallace was innocent. It said the evidence could not carry a conviction. His conviction was quashed, and in the end no murder conviction remained. The National Archives catalog records the outcome as acquitted on appeal.
Later accounts say Wallace returned to the Prudential in an office role rather than to his collecting round, and they describe him as socially shunned. We have not yet verified those points in Prudential employment records or independent contemporary sources. Secondary bibliographic research places the editorial prologue in the 16th of April issue of John Bull and 5 weekly installments under Wallace's name from the 23rd of April. We have not yet examined the original issues. The literature also describes the series as journalistically ghostwritten. That last point matters, and it is why I am not going to read you a sentence as Wallace's own words. They appeared under his name. That is not the same thing. William Herbert Wallace died on the 26th of February, 1933, at Clatterbridge Hospital on the Wirral. He was 54. Secondary sources give the causes as uremia and pyelonephritis. We have not yet seen the death certificate. He had outlived his wife by just over 2 years. So what do we actually know? We know that on the 19th of January 1931, a man giving the name Qualtrough telephoned a chess club and made an appointment at an address that did not exist, from a public box 400 yards from the Wallace's house. We know that the following evening Julia Wallace was beaten to death in her own front parlour, and that a milk boy testified she had been alive at the door that evening, at the time the trial itself treated as reconstructed. We know that her husband spent that evening looking for the address, in front of tram conductors, a police constable, a householder, and a newsagent, and that the search ran past 8 o'clock. We know that no weapon was recovered, that no blood was found on him, and that the money said to be missing rests on his own account. We know that 3 medical witnesses gave estimates so wide and so far apart that the trial judge told the jury the time of death might not be capable of being fixed at all. We know that the jury convicted him in a little over an hour, and that the Court of Criminal Appeal quashed that conviction because the evidence could not support it. And we know that no one has ever been convicted of killing Julia Wallace. The surviving evidence does not force the case into a choice between Wallace and a random intruder. Other scenarios remain possible, but none can be established from the surviving record. Wallace's conviction was quashed, and in the end no murder conviction remained. The case has not, to our knowledge, been the subject of any new official review, reopening, or forensic re-examination. In the official sources checked to the 2nd of August, 2026, no such development was found. In 2018, the case was described in the press as Merseyside's oldest open murder. The current official status remains to be confirmed. Much of this story still turns on the case against Julia's husband. Many accounts recorded Julia's age incorrectly. The last known person to see her alive was a 14-year-old boy holding a milk can, and later retellings made him carry the weight of a time that the trial itself treated as reconstructed. There is no ending here. There is a file, a set of times that cannot be fixed with certainty, and a court that said, correctly, that suspicion is not proof. This was Madame Noir. Some doors never close. Subscribe, and I will see you in the dark.